Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
There was no need to save her, and now you're fired, the head doctor said with a smirk. But before leaving, he glanced into the room of the vagrant. Luisa Rivas was hurrying to work. It was a crisp October morning. As she walked, she wrapped herself tighter in a coat far too light for the weather. Just yesterday, it had been so warm. She hadn't prepared for the sudden change. Tonight, she'd have to go through their things. It was time for her and Rogelio to bundle up for the season. Thinking about her 4-year-old son brought a smile to Luisa's face. He was so serious, so thoughtful. Growing up fast. He'd been attending preschool for some time now. And as if he understood, the little boy avoided causing his mom unnecessary trouble. He'd adjusted to preschool quickly, no crying, no fussing like other kids. In the mornings, he got up easily and even dressed himself. Most importantly, Rogelio was rarely sick. Occasionally, he caught mild colds, but that was it. Luisa could hardly believe her luck. Children of her acquaintances were constantly in and out of hospitals, but not Rogelio. It was as if he understood that his mother couldn't afford to stay home. Otherwise, they'd let her go from the clinic. This private medical center was considered prestigious in their city. It catered to clients willing to pay hefty sums for treatment. The doctors' salaries were quite decent. Luisa was grateful to have secured a position in the surgery department. She and Rogelio needed the money desperately, and losing her job over frequent sick leaves was simply not an option. Luckily, those sick days hadn't been necessary so far. Luisa was raising her son alone. She had no one to lean on. Her mother lived in a village, barely scraping by on her meager pension. On top of that, her heart was failing, and medication cost a fortune. Surgery was necessary, but the price was staggering, far beyond what Luisa or her mother could afford. For now, conservative treatment had to suffice. But as a medic, Luisa knew it couldn't go on like this for long. Eventually, the medication would stop working. She was trying to save every penny to cover the surgery, but progress was painstakingly slow. Understandably so. Luisa rented an apartment in the city, and it wasn't cheap. At least the neighborhood was decent, with the preschool nearby and her workplace within walking distance. Walking to work saved on transportation. Still, they had to eat well. There was a child in the house, after all. Clothes, preschool fees, trips and activities, it all added up. Luisa had long been denying herself little luxuries. Unlike many women her age, she didn't visit beauty salons. She did her nails at home, replaced gym sessions with walking to work and long strolls with her son. Luckily, nature had been kind to Luisa. She had a lovely figure and fresh, youthful skin that didn't need salon treatments. She avoided thinking too much about the future. What if mom doesn't get the surgery in time? How will I manage when Rogelio grows older and his needs multiply? Education, activities, tutors, trendy clothes, teenagers wouldn't settle for just anything. Oh, the thought. For now, Luisa was scraping by. She took side jobs, worked multiple shifts. 4-year-old Rogelio was already sometimes left alone at home. It worried her, of course, leaving her little boy like that. But what choice did she have? Luisa had arranged for her neighbor, Barbara Arroyo, to check in on Rogelio. Barbara occasionally spent time with the boy and made sure he ate at certain hours. Although she couldn't dedicate much time to him, she was busy caring for her disabled husband. She always stopped by to see him. She even refused to accept any money from Luisa for her help. "Oh, come on, it's no trouble for me to check on the little one," Barbara would say. "Do you think I don't see how hard things are for you? You're fighting on your own like a fish out of water. Don't even think about offering me money. Better spend it on some apples for Rogelio." At first, Luisa had been extremely worried about leaving her son alone. But she soon realized that Rogelio was coping just fine. He would play with his building blocks or draw while waiting for her to return from her evening shift. He didn't seem to feel lonely or scared. "He's a good boy," Barbara often said with a smile when talking about Rogelio. "He reminds me of my Renato. I used to leave him home alone too, sometimes for the whole day. What else could I do? I had to work, and the daycare was closed. Back then, everyone did it, and nothing bad happened." Luisa would shake her head. She couldn't imagine leaving her son home alone if it weren't absolutely necessary. But they needed money desperately. For their daily needs, for Rogelio's future, and for the treatment of her mother, the only other family Rogelio and Luisa had in the world. When Rogelio was a baby and not yet in preschool, Luisa's mother had helped a lot. She would come to the city to care for her grandson. But now, her heart condition had worsened so much that she could barely leave her village. Most days, she was bedridden, suffering occasional episodes. Luisa's heart ached for her mother. She'd often thought of bringing her to live with them in the city, where she could keep an eye on her and take care of her. But her mother always refused. "You already have enough on your plate," her mother would say. "I'm better off here in the village. These walls heal me, the air is special, and my friends are close by. They look after me. But you've got Rogelio and work, you don't need more to worry about." Luisa and Rogelio only managed to visit her occasionally when she could arrange a few consecutive days off. Her mother always greeted them with joy, but each time, she looked frilier. Thankfully, her loyal friends, still strong and healthy, were there to help her, support her, and care for her. These women had been her closest companions for a lifetime, closer than sisters. Their children and grandchildren were long grown and independent. Luisa, however, was a late and unexpected gift for her mother, born when no one had anticipated it. Her mother had raised her alone. Luisa had never known her father, and her mother never spoke of him. Whenever Luisa asked, she would brush off the question. It wasn't until Luisa graduated from school that her mother revealed the truth. She had chosen to have a child for herself, with a man who was married, smart, handsome, and someone she deeply loved. "He doesn't know he has a daughter," her mother admitted. "I never told him. Let him live in peace. He never deceived me or made promises. He told me from the start that he was married. It was my choice, and I don't regret it." After that, Luisa stopped asking about her father. She understood that the subject was closed. Still, it comforted her to know he had been an intelligent and handsome man, and that her mother had loved him deeply. Luisa had always dreamed of a complete family. Her plan was clear. First, complete her education and establish a solid foundation, then find a suitable husband, and only after marriage have children, official, loved, and cherished by both parents. Yet, fate had other plans. In the end, Luisa found herself following in her mother's footsteps, with one significant difference: she had been deceived. Having a child just for herself had never been part of Luisa's plan. In school, Luisa had been an excellent student. She worked hard, making her mother proud, and genuinely enjoyed being at the top of her class. Academic success came easily to her. She was particularly drawn to chemistry and biology, devouring books on the subjects and competing in academic Olympiads, where she often won prizes. Her teachers encouraged the bright student to pursue a career in medicine after graduation. Luisa's mother, however, was skeptical. She thought medical school was an unattainable dream, reserved for the privileged few. "That takes connections and money," her mother would say. "And you don't have any special preparation." But Luisa decided to try, and she succeeded. The rigorous demands of medical school began. For students, there was no time for part-time jobs or partying. The sheer volume of material meant keeping one's head down and studying nonstop, especially for those determined to see it through to the end. Luisa dedicated herself fully to her studies. During that challenging and crucial time, her mother supported her financially, ensuring that her daughter wouldn't be distracted by everyday concerns. Luisa made the most of it. She pushed herself hard, struggled at times, but ultimately succeeded. When she finally graduated, she held her diploma with immense pride. It wasn't the red diploma she had hoped for, but there were no failing marks either. She had made it to the finish line, a feat not everyone achieved. Many of her peers had dropped out along the way. Luisa began her career at the regional hospital in the surgical department. Initially assisting seasoned surgeons, she soon began performing operations herself. The experience was indescribable, a mix of fear and fascination. Each case was different, and with each one, Luisa gained more experience. Her colleagues noted her potential, and their praise was a balm to her soul. Compared to her student years, Luisa now had far more free time. She began joining her friends for outings. While they preferred clubs, bars, and dance floors, at least when there was no work the next day, Luisa started to explore the joys she had missed during her studies. Medical school had consumed her almost entirely, leaving no time for leisure. But now, as a young surgeon, she allowed herself small pleasures. And then, he approached her. Luisa was at a club with her friends, enjoying the beginning of a rare, long weekend, 3 whole days off. The week had been tough but rewarding, and she felt lighthearted and carefree. And there he was. A strikingly handsome, charismatic man. Luisa immediately guessed he was about 5 to 7 years older than her. He looked like he had walked straight out of a TV series. His clothes, demeanor, facial features, even the way he moved, all of it exuded charm and confidence. Before he even spoke, Luisa felt her heart sink as if it had fallen out of her chest. She knew she was in trouble. The man introduced himself as Federico Palomares and wasted no time in confessing that Luisa had struck him straight in the heart. "You're so beautiful, absolutely stunning. I couldn't take my eyes off you while you were dancing." Luisa had received compliments before. Some colleagues had tried courting her, and she'd had a few brief, non-committal romances since university. But none of their words had ever affected her as deeply as Federico's. There was something primal in his approach. Her knees turned to jelly, a flush of heat spread through her body, and she felt her cheeks burning, her face practically on fire. Federico, clearly noticing the effect he had on her, smiled again, holding her gaze. "Shall we dance?" Without hesitation, Luisa placed her hand in his outstretched one. On the dance floor, Federico held her close. This was no ordinary dance, it was intimate, electric. At some point, their lips met, and that was it. Luisa suddenly longed to be alone with him. Federico seemed to read her mind. "Should we get out of here?" he suggested. "Yes, let's go to my place," Luisa responded eagerly. "I rent an apartment nearby." They spent 3 incredible days together. During that time, Federico shared a lot about himself. He lived and worked in the capital city, and he had come to Luisa's town for an economic forum to close a business deal. His work was done ahead of schedule, leaving him with unexpected free time to explore the city. "I decided to check out a club, and there you were, a vision. I've never met anyone like you," he said. Luisa looked into his eyes and believed him. She trusted every word Federico spoke. It felt wonderful to be seen as unique, special. Federico promised to take her back to the capital with him. They would live in his apartment, get married, and start a life together. He loved to travel, and when he learned that Luisa had never been anywhere, he immediately began talking about a future vacation at a seaside resort. "I know just the place for us. You'll fall in love with it. I can already picture you in a white swimsuit against turquoise waves. You were made for such beautiful settings." But there was one odd thing. Federico's phone seemed to ring constantly. Sometimes it was work, other times it was friends or family. Every time, he would step away and take the calls in the bathroom, speaking quietly so Luisa couldn't overhear. At the time, this didn't bother her. She was too content with their whirlwind romance to question anything. She felt genuinely happy, grateful to have this unexpected time with him before his departure. Luisa was convinced that their meeting had been orchestrated by fate. How else could such a perfect moment have come to pass? She was certain her life was about to change dramatically. She now had a person she loved deeply, someone she wanted to be with forever. Federico, with his confidence, worldliness, and charm, seemed like someone who could show her everything life had to offer, a guide to a brighter, broader future. Federico left. Luisa accompanied him to the airport 3 days after they met. She barely held back tears as they said goodbye. Federico also seemed upset. The night before, they had talked a lot about their future together. He reassured her that everything would be fine, emphasizing that distance was no obstacle in this modern age. He promised to call often. But the call never came. Not a couple of hours later, not that evening, not ever. Luisa couldn't call Federico herself, she didn't have his number. He had taken hers, but she hadn't thought to get his, why would she? They had spent every moment of the last 3 days together. She figured she would get it later when he called. Initially, Luisa convinced herself there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe something had happened at the airport, or he felt unwell. It seemed impossible that Federico could forget her as soon as he returned to the capital. She replayed their time together in her mind, the way he looked at her, the things he said. That kind of connection couldn't be faked. But Federico had vanished. He was gone from her life without a trace. Luisa couldn't focus, even at work. Thoughts of Federico consumed her. Desperate for answers, she turned to the internet. It was the only place to start. What did she know about Federico? His name, approximate age, job title, and the company he worked for. She remembered the logo she had seen on his laptop and notebook. It was a start. After some searching, she found the company's website and spent nearly an hour poring over corporate photos. Finally, she found Federico in a group picture. His name was tagged, leading her to his social media profile. And there, she encountered a shock. Federico was a devoted family man, a caring husband to a beautiful wife and a doting father to 2 adorable daughters. His profile was filled with photos that painted a vivid picture of his life, a stunning home, family vacations by the sea, cozy celebrations. Federico was often captured embracing his wife, a woman who exuded elegance and happiness. His love for her seemed unmistakable in every image. Luisa's world crumbled. Her vision blurred, and her chest felt tight. Everything familiar suddenly felt foreign and wrong. Why had he pretended? Why act so smitten, only to vanish? The answer was clear. Federico had spent 3 days amusing himself with a naive young woman, spinning a web of lies. To him, it was likely routine. Luisa was furious at herself. The signs had been there, the secretive phone calls, his over-the-top charm. If she had been more cautious, she might have seen through him. She endured sleepless nights, crying into her pillow and torturing herself by revisiting his profile. Each picture felt like a slap in the face, yet she couldn't look away. Luisa told no one about her fleeting romance. Despite not being at fault, she felt ashamed, as if her gullibility was the real betrayal. Weeks passed. The storm in her heart settled, and her mind cleared. Luisa emerged from the ordeal stronger, changed. She vowed never to trust someone at face value again. What had happened with Federico, though painful, became a lesson, a hard but necessary one. But then came another surprise, something Luisa hadn't expected at all. She experienced a delay, something unusual for her. Luisa assumed it was due to the recent stress. The thought of pregnancy didn't even cross her mind since she and Federico had taken precautions to prevent it. Luisa had always been very cautious in such matters. She decided to consult a doctor at her own hospital. The doctor conducted an examination and then delivered shocking news. "You're pregnant. Around 4 to 5 weeks along. Congratulations." Luisa almost fell out of her chair. This was the last thing she needed. "Are you planning to keep it?" "I don't know yet," Luisa stammered. The news left her stunned, throwing her world into chaos once again. Luisa spent days contemplating what to do. In her turmoil, she decided to reach out to Federico, messaging him through the social media account she had found. His reply was curt. He told her to terminate the pregnancy. He even offered to send money and asked for her bank details. Not that Luisa had been expecting anything better. She knew he was married and a liar, but his response still hurt. Out of frustration and anger, she replied that she would keep the baby, take a DNA test, and file for child support. "Okay, that's your choice," Federico responded. "But keep in mind, if you do that, I'll take custody, and you'll never see the child again." Who do you think a court will favor, a mother without a house or stable job, or a wealthy father with connections? It's up to you. And for me, what's the difference? I already have 2 kids, a third won't change anything. My wife won't mind, she's in no position to protest. After that reply, Luisa decided never to contact Federico again. He wouldn't help her. To him, she was just a fling, a gullible girl he had deceived, a naive fool. Federico clearly didn't want the complication of an unplanned child. Federico probably knew how to read people well. He must have realized Luisa would be afraid of losing her baby and wouldn't dare pursue him further. He knew exactly how to respond to a confused and vulnerable young woman. Luisa came to one conclusion: she couldn't go through with an abortion. She already loved the tiny life growing inside her. This little one was blameless, innocent of his father's deceit or his mother's naivety. The child shouldn't have to pay for their mistakes. Her decision made, Luisa felt a sense of calm. She understood that she was in for a difficult journey. She would have to face it alone. There was no one to rely on. Her mother was ill and spent her modest pension on medication. There was no partner or father figure for her child. But Luisa told herself she would manage somehow. Others had done it before, and she would too. She saved up as much money as she could before going on maternity leave and prepared for the baby's arrival. Her friends and colleagues pitched in, some bought essentials, others passed down items from their children or grandchildren. By the time little Rogelio was born, everything was ready for him: a crib, a stroller, and clothes for the year ahead. The maternity leave was anything but easy for Luisa. Her savings quickly ran out, the government benefits were meager, and she had to take on evening side jobs, like mopping the floors in apartment buildings. There was no other way to make ends meet. Yet, not for a single moment did Luisa regret her decision to keep Rogelio. He was growing into such a caring, intelligent, and attentive little boy. Sometimes, after a long day, when Luisa was too exhausted even to change clothes or lie down to rest, Rogelio would flash her a smile or say something sweet. Instantly, her heart would fill with warmth and light. It was tough, but she had no choice but to carry on. Luisa managed to get through the hardest years and raised her son until he was old enough to start preschool. She was finally able to return to work. And as luck would have it, something extraordinary happened shortly after her maternity leave ended. The government-run clinic where she worked came under the management of a prominent businessman in their city. As a result, they began offering private services alongside their standard care. This change significantly improved the salaries of the staff, including Luisa. The pay raise couldn't have come at a better time. Her mother's health had deteriorated severely, and she urgently needed to save for her surgery. Raising a child on her own was challenging enough, so the extra income was a blessing. Luisa was more than willing to take on additional shifts, even overnight ones, to make ends meet. Fortunately, Rogelio was mature enough to stay home without her, and Barbara often looked after him. He was never completely left on his own. Late again? The disdainful voice of the senior nurse, Antonia, greeted Luisa as she arrived at the clinic. Antonia, much older and more tenured than Luisa, often spoke down to her. She behaved obsequiously toward more experienced doctors but spread gossip behind their backs while smiling sweetly to their faces. To Luisa, Antonia always resembled a jackal, and her predatory smile only reinforced the image. Antonia wasn't particularly liked at the hospital, but most avoided conflicts with her. She had established a good rapport with the chief doctor, to whom she reported staff behavior, who took long lunches, arrived late, or spent too much time chatting on the phone during work hours. "Good morning, Antonia. I'm not late." Look, I'm right on time, Luisa replied with a smile. She didn't want to create friction with someone like Antonia and disliked arguing over trivial matters in general. You're supposed to arrive 10 minutes early, Antonia sneered. You still need to change, and here you are, cutting it close again. Luisa remained silent. She didn't see the point in explaining the little challenges of her morning, how Rogelio had forgotten his backpack at home, forcing her to return for it, or how they'd had to navigate around a massive puddle blocking the road to the preschool. Antonia wouldn't understand. She didn't have a husband or children. She lived alone, enjoying her life, or so the colleagues said. But Luisa didn't envy her in the slightest. On the contrary, she even felt sorry for her. To Luisa, loneliness seemed unbearably bleak. Quickly, Luisa headed upstairs to the staff room. There, Clementina and Teodor were sipping coffee at a small table. They both had patient rounds coming up, but for now, there was still time to relax. Everyone greeted each other warmly. Luisa slipped into the locker room and swiftly changed into her white coat. That was it. She was ready for the workday. It didn't seem like a particularly hectic day ahead. The scheduled surgeries weren't until tomorrow. Luisa completed her rounds, pleased to find that all her patients were doing remarkably well. It was the kind of day she loved, everything running smoothly, almost as if life followed a script or manual. The morning flew by unnoticed. After lunch, Luisa intended to head back to her office to review patient records one more time. But as she passed a cafeteria window, something outside caught her eye. The view overlooked the hospital's front steps, and there, hunched over on the cold stone steps, was a dark, shadowy figure swaying gently from side to side. Luisa immediately recognized the movement, a person trying to rock themselves through pain. Strangely, no one seemed to be helping. Look, Luisa said, pointing out the figure to her colleagues. That person's in bad shape, Arcadia observed. You younger ones go check it out, she added. Luisa and Teodor hurried toward the entrance. By the time they reached the steps, a security guard was already crouched next to the hunched figure. What's going on here? Luisa asked. She's not well, the guard replied. But she can't really say what's wrong. Probably drunk. Luisa saw an elderly woman, clearly a vagabond. Her tattered, patched-up coat revealed tufts of synthetic stuffing spilling out. A dirty scarf covered her head, and her feet were shoved into worn-out gray sneakers that didn't fit. But what struck Luisa the most were the woman's eyes, filled with pain and despair. What's wrong? Luisa asked gently. The woman tried to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she clutched at her stomach. Luisa recognized the symptoms immediately. She had seen cases like this before. Her hands gently pressed the woman's hollow, emaciated abdomen. The surface beneath her fingers was hard and tense, exactly what Luisa expected. She needs an ultrasound and urgent blood tests, Luisa directed. By now, a small group had gathered, including nurses and other staff members. Antonia stood among them, watching closely. Several people rushed to follow Luisa's instructions, while she and Clementina tried to lift the elderly woman off the icy steps. Every movement seemed excruciating for her, her face twisted in pain. What are you doing? Antonia hissed, stepping forward as she realized what was happening. This is a private clinic. We offer paid services. Do you really think this beggar can pay? Luisa met Antonia's cold, angry eyes directly. And what do you suggest we do? Call an ambulance for her and let them deal with it. Not our problem. She's in critical condition, Luisa countered. We're talking minutes here. Waiting for an ambulance, then the transport time, and then the hospital intake process, that could kill her. Antonia's eyes narrowed. You do realize this could get you into trouble? Antonia's eyes flashed with anger. The chief doctor isn't here right now. He would definitely forbid this. I won't allow it. At least call him and ask for permission. There's no time, Antonia. With Teodor's help, Luisa practically dragged the increasingly weakening patient toward the hospital entrance, where a gurney was already waiting. "Just wait. You'll regret this later." Antonia followed close behind, not losing pace. "Because of you, we'll all get in trouble. You're putting everyone at risk." "I'll take full responsibility," Luisa replied. "I'm a doctor. Now, go away and stop interfering." Antonia gasped in indignation, wanting to say something else, but then shrugged and disappeared into the hospital corridors. Perhaps she was running to report to the chief. It didn't matter. Luisa would help this woman before Antonia could try to stop her again. The ultrasound revealed internal bleeding. The lab results confirmed the same. There was no other option. The operating room had to be prepared. The nurses were quick and efficient. The team was assembled, and the instruments were readied in no time. As Luisa began the operation, she had no idea what she would face. The responsibility was enormous. The patient might not survive. But there was no other choice. The situation was critical, if not dire. A traumatic appendix rupture, likely due to an injury. There was a high risk of peritonitis. Luisa rarely encountered cases this severe. She worked slowly, meticulously, and carefully. She couldn't have done it alone. Her team's help was invaluable. In the end, everything seemed to go as well as possible under the circumstances. The operation had been as successful as it could be. The patient's age and her overall condition, however, were still worrisome. She had clearly lived a life on the streets, which meant hunger, sleep deprivation, stress, and likely numerous other infections. Luisa hoped with all her heart that the patient would wake up from anesthesia and eventually recover from such a serious operation. The nurse took the elderly woman to the ICU. Luisa removed her surgical cap and mask, washed her hands, changed, and headed to her office. There was still plenty of paperwork waiting for her. Her emotions were a mixture of anxiety and relief. She had saved a life, after all. But she was also concerned about many things. The critical condition of the patient, who might not survive the anesthesia, and how the chief doctor would react. Antonia was right, Luisa wouldn't be praised for such a bold move. On the other hand, there was no other option. Waiting for an ambulance or sending the patient to another hospital, where delays would arise due to the elderly woman's lack of documents, would have led to her certain death. At least now the woman had a chance. A real chance. After all, the surgery had been successful. Luisa became immersed in her paperwork, and time passed unnoticed. When Clementina burst into the office, it was already nearly 5 o'clock. Just a little longer, and she could go home. "The chief is back," her friend announced, looking anxious. Of course, Antonia has already rushed to him. She's probably reported everything, especially about our homeless woman, and likely twisted the facts in her own way. "They say he's furious and wants to see you." Luisa sighed heavily. She had been prepared for this, but it was still unpleasant. At that moment, Antonia entered the office with a beaming expression. "Luisa, the boss is waiting for you," she said, her smile not even bothering to hide her satisfaction. "Looks like you'll finally get what you deserve." "And you're so happy about it," Clementina scoffed. "You know, why don't you go do your job?" Antonia shot back. "I think it's time for the evening rounds, and here you are, gossiping." Luisa stood up and slowly made her way to the chief doctor's office on the 3rd floor. Teodor Fortune was a man of few words, but stern. Tall, completely gray-haired, always clean-shaven, he had an air of strictness and discipline about him. Just his presence commanded respect. He resembled a massive rock, likely just as inaccessible, cold, and impartial. The conversation was short and unpleasant. The chief doctor didn't raise his voice, but he looked at Luisa as if she were the most despicable, unworthy being on earth. Clearly, Antonia had already stirred him up. "You violated every possible protocol, took in a street person for surgery, with no documents, a vagrant, a homeless person. And what if she had died on your table? Have you thought about that?" Does our hospital need such a reputation? There was no other option. There's always an option. The protocol called for calling an ambulance, and she would have been taken to the state clinic. It's just a few blocks away. We wouldn't have made it in time. And did you think about our other patients? The respectable ones, the ones who pay large sums for treatment here? Do you think they would appreciate knowing that we're saving vagrants who could be carrying God knows what kind of infections? She's still a person. Luisa wanted to speak but couldn't find the words to explain her feelings. How could I leave this woman without helping her? She was fighting through the pain, using her last strength to get to the hospital, the first one she found. This woman didn't care about the reputation of a private clinic, she just wanted to live. Well, Theodore concluded, finish your shift tomorrow and we'll part ways. What? Luisa looked at her boss with eyes full of despair. She expected a deduction from her bonus, a reprimand added to her work record, or anything else, but not dismissal. That would have been a complete catastrophe for her. Well, this is it, my dear, constant tardiness. Yes, I know everything. Believe me, you've been violating workplace discipline, getting too familiar with patients, prescribing unnecessary tests, not being mindful of the clinic's budget, and now this. Your actions today are beyond the line. We're parting ways, and this decision is final. If you continue to protest, I'll fire you for cause, and then you'll never work anywhere again. I strongly advise against that. Luisa nodded silently and left. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through her mind. How was she supposed to live now? How would she pay for rent? The due date was fast approaching. How could she feed and clothe her child? And her mom, she needed money for surgery. The next day passed like a blur. Luisa mechanically spoke to her son, cooked something, tidied up, ate. Everything seemed unreal, like a bad and unpleasant dream. The next morning, in the first moments after waking up, Luisa almost believed it had all been a dream. But then the heavy, grim reality fell on her like an unbearable weight, and tears welled up in her eyes. However, Luisa quickly wiped them away, as Rogelio burst into the room, beaming. Mom, can I watch cartoons before kindergarten? Of course, my dear. At the clinic, Luisa was greeted on the doorstep by Clementina, who immediately hugged her tightly. We went to Theodore yesterday, tried to defend you, but we didn't manage to do anything. Luisa smiled. It felt good to hear that the team had tried to save her. Such support. It meant a lot to Luisa, even if it hadn't worked out. That Antonia, she's the one to blame for everything, whispering in his ear, slandering everyone. Why is it that good people get fired, and these rats just live their lives without any consequences? Well, I don't know, Luisa replied with a sad smile. And how is my patient? She seems okay, at least she's come around. You saved her, no doubt about it. Well, that's the most important thing, right? Clementina shrugged. In her office, Luisa began to sort through the documents, as she always did in the mornings. She also had some coffee, since she hadn't had time for it at home. It was time for rounds. What worried Luisa most was the elderly woman from yesterday. She was concerned about her. Did Luisa regret not leaving the homeless woman in her time of need? No, absolutely not. If this had happened again, even knowing the consequences, Luisa would have done the same. Yes, things would be tough now. She'd have to find a new job and figure out a way to make ends meet. But at least the woman was alive, and Luisa bore no guilt for leaving her in mortal danger. Living with that kind of guilt would have been far harder than facing the sudden problems that had fallen on her now. Luisa put on her white coat, grabbed her folder, and headed out for rounds. Some patients already knew about Luisa's trouble. Probably the nurses had told them. They openly expressed their regret that they would no longer see such a compassionate and good doctor. They wished her good luck in her new place and voiced their displeasure with the chief doctor's decision. These sincere words lifted her spirits. She began to believe that everything would be fine in the new place she would eventually find. Finally, all the easy patients had been seen. There was only the woman from the ICU left. Clementina had said that the patient had already come to, and Luisa needed to make sure everything was all right with her. In the hallway on her way to the ICU, Luisa met Antonia. The head nurse gave the young doctor a disdainful look and didn't even respond to Luisa's greeting. With her head held high, Antonia walked past her. It was clear that she no longer considered the young, reprimanded surgeon a member of the team. Strangely, at that moment, Luisa felt sorry for Antonia. Luisa understood why the head nurse was behaving this way. A series of failures in her personal life, complete loneliness, despite being a pretty woman. No doubt, that led to envy, even toward Luisa, the single mother. After all, Luisa still had Rogelio, while Antonia had no one. It was easy to imagine Antonia, in the evening, in an empty apartment, shedding tears over her unfulfilled fate in the dim light of her kitchen. In the end, Luisa didn't feel resentment toward Antonia. And here was the ICU ward. Luisa opened the door and entered. The patient wasn't asleep. She lay on a special bed, with wires leading to her chest and arms, and the machinery hummed steadily. The woman's graying hair was tied into a neat, tight bun. The nurses had done well. The elderly patient's features even seemed somewhat aristocratic, somehow. A straight nose, dark eyebrows, high cheekbones, well-proportioned features, beautiful gray eyes. It was like looking at an elderly countess. When the woman saw Luisa, she weakly smiled. "So, you're my savior. They told me about you. And described you. I didn't remember anything yesterday. I was in so much pain, everything was dark before my eyes, but I immediately recognized you from the description. They were right, you're simply beautiful." Luisa smiled. The patient was speaking clearly, even beautifully, so she must be feeling quite well. "Good morning. As I can see, you're on the mend." Luisa stepped closer. "May I examine you?" Of course, the woman agreed easily. "It's even necessary." Luisa carefully examined the incision, palpated the woman's abdomen, then reviewed the paperwork that the nurses had filled out. The patient had been frequently monitored for temperature, and it was normal, which was certainly encouraging. "It seems that things are indeed going well with you," Luisa said. "And it's all thanks to you. They told me you literally pulled me back from the brink of death, that you performed a very difficult operation. Yes, you can't argue with that. The situation was critical and required immediate intervention. You were lucky. If you'd been 10 minutes later, it could have been all over." Yes, they told me that too. I feel like I've been born again. Do you remember your name, who you are, where you came from, and what happened to you?" "I remember. Just recently. Literally an hour ago, my memories returned. Before that, your chief doctor was questioning me. He kept trying to find out where I was from, whether I could pay for the clinic's services. But I didn't know anything at that time. I didn't know who I was. He didn't believe me, kept insisting I explain everything, tell him, and even threatened to throw me out on the street. He was just scaring you," Luisa explained. "He wouldn't have thrown you out. He would have just called an ambulance and sent you to another hospital. Here, you know, we offer paid services, and you probably didn't have any money, but that's okay. The important thing is that the operation was successful. Now, any hospital will help you recover. There's nothing supernatural about what we did here, to be honest. But I can pay. I'll pay for everything," the woman said, looking at Luisa with a kind smile. "Then, maybe, you won't have any problems, and I'll thank you separately." "What do you mean?" Luisa asked, confused. She thought her patient was a homeless person. The woman was wearing an old dress and dirty, worn-out clothes. Where would such a person suddenly find money? "I know. The nurses told me you went against the management because of me. Even knowing the consequences, you took it upon yourself to save a poor homeless woman. That's how they all saw me. An incredible act. I didn't even think there were still people like you today." Well, who else would have acted differently? Time was literally running out. Many, my dear, many would have acted differently. Including that nurse of yours. A nasty one, I don't remember her name. Luisa smiled. She understood exactly who the patient was talking about. So, she had already met Antonia. But they won't fire you. What's more, they'll even reward you because I'll pay for everything, my treatment, even beyond the bill. And as for you, my dear, I'll write a thank you letter to the Ministry of Health. The country should know its heroes. Stop it, I'm no hero. Luisa couldn't understand anything. This woman spoke so intelligently and coherently, which was something Luisa had never expected. What's more, the woman kept saying she'd pay for everything and thus save Luisa from any trouble. Tell me, who should I call about you? You've regained your memory, and that's wonderful. But your relatives must be worried. Do you have any relatives? Yes, I do have family, far away, across the ocean. So, they haven't had the chance to lose me yet, I think. Everything happened so quickly. What happened? Luisa asked, her curiosity growing. The elderly woman's eyes softened at the mention of her family. Perhaps I should introduce myself first. My name is Manila Vidales. I can see you're genuinely interested in hearing my story. I'm very interested. And I have time, Luisa replied, settling herself more comfortably on the edge of the patient's bed. She had already finished her most important tasks for the day, and this was a rare opportunity to spend some time with an unusual patient. What was the worst that could happen? If Antonia went running to the chief again, it wouldn't matter now. Luisa was already on her way out. Besides, her only scheduled operation for the day was still 2 hours away. Manila's story began to unfold as she spoke. Manila was born into a large, poor family. Her father worked at a factory, and her mother took care of the home and the children. Manila was the oldest, and from a young age, she helped her mother with everything because she pitied her. Her mother's health wasn't great, her heart would often trouble her, and Manila would clean the floors, help with the younger children, and cook for the family when her mother was unwell. Her father worked double shifts to provide for the large family, but money was always tight. There was never any luxury, just enough for clothes, food, and bills. Manila never asked for anything from her parents. She understood their situation. At just 15, tragedy struck. Her beloved mother passed away, and all of the household responsibilities fell squarely on Manila's young shoulders. It was incredibly hard. Manila had always helped her mother and learned many things, but it was one thing to be an assistant and quite another to bear the entire burden alone. And, of course, she still had school to contend with. Her grades dropped as she had to take care of cooking, cleaning, and looking after her younger siblings. There was no time for homework. Her father didn't help her. He came home tired and angry and turned to alcohol. After his wife's death, he became an alcoholic, and he would make complaints if anything wasn't perfect, if there was a mess, or if the soup was too salty. Manila understood, though. She could see that it was hard for him too, just as it was hard for her to live without her mother. She didn't resent him. As time went on, Manila managed to finish school with mediocre grades, mostly because of sympathy from her teachers given her circumstances. Naturally, she didn't get into any universities. Like her father, she went to work at the factory. By then, her younger siblings had grown up a bit and were able to take care of themselves more, so Manila didn't have to supervise them all the time. However, most of the household duties still fell on her. Washing, cooking for the whole family, cleaning, everyone had gotten used to it. Time passed, and the younger siblings grew up, left the nest, and moved to other cities to study and work. Gradually, they started their own families. Occasionally, they visited, bringing their children and partners. Manila was always happy to see them. After all, they were her relatives, her beloved younger siblings, whom she had raised almost like her own children. Her father had died, drinking himself to death in the end. It had been difficult for Manila with him. And although there had never been warm, trusting relations between them throughout her life, it was still hard for her to be completely alone. Manila had never started her own family. In the beginning, there had been no time for it. Family responsibilities and worries always took priority, and her father's drinking didn't help either. Manila had become exhausted, overburdened. Once the younger siblings had grown up and were more independent, she could finally breathe a little easier. But she didn't want to dive headfirst into having small children again, dealing with cooking and cleaning. So, Manila had occasional short-lived romances, nothing more. But after her father's death, Manila realized that the loneliness was starting to weigh on her. The thing was, she felt like she was past the age for anything serious. Her friends, peers, had already raised their children, some of them even had grandchildren to take care of. Manila decided that she would likely spend the rest of her life alone. However, fate had other plans. One day, a commission visited their factory. This happened often for exchange of experience, signing of important contracts, and so on. One of the members of this commission began to show Manila attention, which was completely unexpected. Manila never considered herself particularly beautiful, although she often received compliments about her appearance. And, of course, there was the matter of her age. Yes, this man wasn't exactly a young man either, but he was handsome, charismatic, clearly wealthy. Men like that usually paid attention to young beauties. But here he was, looking at her, smiling in a way that made her shiver. He even gave her compliments. Manila decided not to resist the feelings because, after all, what did she have to lose? She was living alone anyway. Marquez invited her on a date. Manila had never met such a gallant suitor before. Next to him, she felt like nothing less than a countess or even a queen. Marquez shared his story. He was a wealthy man in his city, owning a small factory, and had raised 2 daughters on his own. His wife had passed away many years ago when their children were still very young. Marquez didn't want his daughters to have a stepmother. He had grown up with a stepmother himself and remembered the coldness, irritation, and anger she had shown him, which she hadn't even tried to hide. So, Marquez had kept his daughters close, raising them by himself. But as the girls grew up, they moved away to study in another country. And there, they stayed. Marquez felt his loneliness fully. There were, of course, plenty of women around the wealthy man, of all ages, including the young beauties who had just come of age. But it didn't interest him. There was a lack of sincerity, just playing a part. What he longed for were real feelings, warmth, and acceptance. With Manila, he immediately felt a connection, which he shared with her on their first date. And, as it turned out, he was right. Very quickly, Manila and Marquez became one. And so, a completely different life began for Manila. She moved from her hometown to live with Marquez. She had nothing left in her small hometown, no one to stay for, except maybe work. But Marquez quickly realized that Manila didn't belong on his factory. There, she was just making money. He noticed how his beloved had an ability to find beauty and wonder in the ordinary, so he enrolled her in courses with a famous photographer. At first, Manila didn't want to go. She thought it was all nonsense and wondered why she should study at her age. But then, once she got into it, she realized that this was her true calling, capturing beautiful moments and sharing them with the world. Now, her works were admired by people from all corners of the globe. Manila also got to know Marquez's daughters. They visited their father often and loved him dearly. She immediately hit it off with them, and they accepted her. They all became one family. Manila felt truly happy with Marquez by her side. Moreover, she now had her own beloved passion. Marquez showed her a completely new life. They traveled a lot, saw the world, and Manila blossomed and seemed to grow younger from the abundance of experiences. Despite their different life paths, she and Marquez were on the same wavelength and understood each other without words. But the years flew by in a blur. The couple grew older. Marquez, having stepped away from business, seemed to quickly age, and his heart began to cause problems. In the end, he passed away from a heart attack. And so, Manila was left alone again in the large, beautiful house with a mountain of memories of her once happy life. Marquez's daughters still invite me to visit them, Manila said, shaking her head. I fly to see them sometimes, but I don't like it there. Everything feels so foreign, and my brothers and sisters are too far away. It's even a little frightening. But here is home. There was so much emotion in Manila's words that Luisa's heart tightened. She understood this elderly woman. I have neighbors here, friends. We communicate a lot, walk together. My brothers and sisters come to visit. And in the mornings, when everyone is still asleep, I go to the park. I walk along the empty alleys and take photographs. But how did you end up in such a difficult situation? Luisa asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind. Manila spoke so fluently, so well, and everything in her story seemed consistent. Yet, the fact remained, the elderly woman had been found on the hospital's doorstep in torn, dirty clothes. Rich business heiresses don't dress like that. Could Manila have lost her mind? Maybe all of this was just a fabrication. Perhaps the poor woman didn't even realize she was delirious. That morning, I went to the park, just like always, Manila continued. It was still early, the city was asleep. And then they came. They were young men, 3 of them, they attacked me. Manila didn't have time to react before they grabbed her and twisted her arms behind her back. She was terrified, her heart nearly dropped into her stomach. The elderly woman was ready to give them everything they wanted without resistance, but they hit her on the head, and everything before her eyes blurred. There was a ringing in her ears, and through the fog, Manila watched as the 3 of them robbed her. They took her expensive camera, her bag with documents and bank cards, but that wasn't enough for them. One of the young men shook the elderly woman out of her coat, which was expensive and branded. It was probably worth a good sum. The second one was already removing her designer leather boots. Of course, they didn't overlook her jewelry. The gold chain and bracelet were gifts from Marquez. When Manila regained consciousness, she didn't remember anything about what had happened. She only understood that she was in a park, on an empty alley, and dressed completely inappropriately for the weather. She didn't know who she was, where her home was. Confused, she stumbled over to the trash bins, where she found an old coat, worn-out oversized sneakers, and some dirty but warm scarf. She put on all these things. Something inside of her resisted. They didn't feel right, but she was so cold that there was no time to care about how they looked. And then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my stomach, so intense that tears came to my eyes. I didn't know who I was or what my name was, but I knew I had to get to a hospital. So, I crawled. The first hospital I came across was yours. I managed to climb the steps of the porch, and that's when I lost all my strength. And then, you found me. After the operation, Manila, once she came to her senses, didn't remember anything about herself. She was questioned by the unpleasant chief doctor, to whom she couldn't provide any information. Then, her memories came rushing back. They overwhelmed her like waves, and she even felt dizzy from the sudden flood of recollections. But now, Manila knew everything about herself. And instantly, she felt lighter inside, the fear disappeared. She would be able to pay for the operation. She had somewhere to go, even had close people, Marquez's daughters, her brothers, and sisters. She wasn't a lonely homeless beggar. This is simply incredible, Luisa smiled. Now, she understood that her patient would be okay. And this knowledge gave her peace of mind. Luisa hurried to work. She had stayed at the same clinic, in her familiar surgical department. Moreover, everything was now easier because the chief doctor had changed. Theodore had been replaced by a young, energetic man who saw patients as people, not wallets with legs. His attentive care for the sick and understanding of the value of each life greatly appealed to Luisa. She enjoyed talking to Horacio Valles, and it seemed that he also wanted to see her more often. Clementina quickly noticed the chemistry between them and, as she put it, the sparks flying. She predicted a romance between Luisa and the new chief. Luisa hoped that Clementina was right and that it would indeed happen. Theodore, on the other hand, was transferred to an administrative position in the ministry. Sorting through paperwork, Clementina said, as if she knew everything. Manila wrote a letter in which she expressed her thoughts about how the chief doctor was clearly not in the right position. This letter triggered numerous investigations because it wasn't the first such complaint. Soon after, Theodore was transferred to another position. The news was received with joy by most of the staff. Antonia, of course, was upset, but no one doubted that she would manage to get along with the new boss. As promised, Manila generously thanked Luisa. Luisa felt uncomfortable. "Don't mention it, I'm a doctor, I took an oath. It's my job, my duty. I couldn't have done otherwise. You knew you'd face trouble, and still, you helped a homeless wanderer, expecting nothing in return. Consider it as pulling a lucky ticket. Maybe fate was testing you, and you passed the test. That means you're deserving of a reward." Manila paid for Luisa's mother's surgery, and now she was completely healthy and full of energy. The woman moved in with her daughter and found a job. Finally, Luisa had help with the child, making her life much easier and more pleasant. Luisa and Manila became friends. They often visited each other, and Rogelio even considered the elderly woman his second grandmother. Luisa often thought about Manila's words, about how it seemed that fate had been testing her that morning. It seemed that was indeed the case. And Luisa had passed the test. Now, everything in her life had changed for the better. It was almost like a fairy tale. Such things do happen.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.